Twins were never a miracle. For most of human history, they were a crisis. Two mouths, one mother, and a world that rarely forgave the difference. You'd think ancient people celebrated twins the way we do now. Except in many cultures, the birth of twins wasn't good news. It was a decision. Right now, if a woman gives birth to twins, doctors monitor the pregnancy for months in advance. There are extra checkups, extra preparation, extra celebration. Two babies means double the joy. That's the modern story. It is almost never the ancient one. For most of human history, a body could barely produce enough milk, enough warmth, enough attention for one infant, let alone two. And when a second child arrived unannounced, entire communities had to answer a question no parent should ever have to face. Who survives? Let's start with the biology, because it explains why this problem existed at all. Human pregnancies evolved around a single offspring. Unlike many mammals, humans give birth to babies that are almost helpless. No fur, no ability to walk, no ability to cling to a parent's body. A human infant needs near constant care for years, not weeks. One infant already stretches a hunter-gatherer mother to her limit. Twins multiply that demand instantly, without multiplying the resources available to meet it. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups have found something striking. Twin birth rates vary enormously by population, but the survival outcome for twins was almost always worse than for single births. Not slightly worse, dramatically worse. In some documented societies, one twin dying shortly after birth wasn't a tragedy that occasionally happened. It was closer to an expectation. Here's the part that's difficult to sit with. In several ethnographically studied cultures, the death of one twin wasn't always an accident of nature. It was sometimes a deliberate choice made by the mother, the family, or the community. Anthropologist Kim Hill, whose research on hunter-gatherer resource sharing has already reshaped how we understand ancient cooperation, also documented something darker in his broader fieldwork among small-scale societies. When resources were scarce, twin infanticide wasn't rare. It was, in some populations, a recognized practice with its own quiet rules. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was survival math, applied to a situation that offered no good options. If a mother could not produce enough milk to keep two infants alive, and no other lactating woman in the group could help, then attempting to raise both often meant losing both. Communities that had lived through famine, through failed hunts, through winters that killed the weak, understood this equation better than we ever will. A single surviving child was, in the coldest possible sense, a better outcome than two dead ones. But survival math wasn't the only force at work. Belief mattered just as much as biology. Among the Nuer and Dinka peoples of East Africa, studied extensively by anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard in the 20th century, twins were not considered ordinary children at all. They were classified as something closer to birds, not human in the usual sense, a separate category of being, tied to the sky rather than the earth. This wasn't an insult. It was closer to reverence mixed with unease. A birth that broke the expected pattern of one mother, one child, was treated as something that had crossed a boundary it shouldn't have. In some West African traditions, the opposite happened. Among the Yoruba people of present-day Nigeria, twins were not feared, they were sacred. Yoruba communities have one of the highest natural twinning rates ever recorded, and rather than treating this as dangerous, their culture built an entire spiritual framework around it. Twins were believed to share a single soul split between two bodies. If one twin died, families commissioned a carved wooden figure, known as an ere ibeji, to represent the lost child. The figure was fed, clothed, and cared for, as though the child were still alive. The soul, they believed, could not be allowed to feel abandoned. Two neighboring regions of the same continent. Two completely different answers to the exact same biological event. That contrast alone tells you something important. Ancient responses to twins were never really about the twins themselves. They were about what a culture needed to believe in order to survive its own environment. Then there's the mythology. And this is where the pattern becomes almost impossible to ignore. Twin narratives appear independently in cultures that had no contact with one another. In Roman mythology, Romulus and Remus, two brothers raised by a wolf, one of whom kills the other before founding a city. In Vedic mythology, the Ashvins, twin horseman gods associated with healing and the boundary between life and death. In Yoruba cosmology, the twin Orishas linked to fortune and protection. In Greek mythology, Castor and Pollux, one mortal, one divine, sharing immortality between them because neither could bear to lose the other. Why does this keep happening? Why do so many unrelated cultures build entire mythologies around twin figures? And why do those myths so often involve death, sacrifice, or a boundary between worlds? One explanation comes from how rare and disruptive twin births actually were before modern medicine. A single birth followed a predictable rhythm that every community understood. Twins broke that rhythm. They were statistically unusual enough to feel significant and dangerous enough, biologically, to demand an explanation. Human minds are pattern-seeking machines. When something rare and high stakes happens, we don't leave it unexplained. We build a story around it, one that gives the event meaning, and often one that gives survivors permission to act. That's the uncomfortable truth underneath a lot of ancient twin mythology. These weren't just stories. They were frameworks that helped communities make impossible decisions feel less impossible. If twins were birds, not fully human, then a family did not have to carry the same guilt. If twins shared one soul, then losing one wasn't quite the same as losing a whole person. Belief did the work that grief alone couldn't do. Archaeology adds another layer to this. Double infant burials, containing two skeletons of similar age placed together in the same grave, have been found at multiple prehistoric sites across Europe and Asia, some dating back tens of thousands of years. Researchers can't always confirm biological twinship from bones alone, but the deliberate placement, the shared grave, the evident care taken in burial, suggests something important. Even when survival forced impossible choices, ancient communities did not treat their dead casually. Loss was marked. Loss was mourned. The decisions made in scarcity did not mean the absence of feeling. That distinction matters because it's easy from a modern vantage point to read ancient infanticide practices as evidence of a harsher, less loving version of humanity. The archaeological and ethnographic record suggests something more complicated. These were not people who valued their children less than we do. They were people who faced constraints we can barely imagine, and who built rituals, myths, and social systems specifically designed to hold the emotional weight of decisions no parent should have to make. There's one more piece of this that's easy to miss. Twins didn't just create a crisis for individual families. They tested something about the entire community's capacity for cooperation. In groups where multiple women could nurse a child that wasn't biologically their own, a practice called allomaternal care, twin survival rates improved dramatically. A second lactating woman, a grandmother, an aunt, even an unrelated member of the group willing to help could be the difference between one surviving infant and two. Communities with stronger networks of shared caregiving didn't just cope with twins better. They may have been shaped, generation after generation, by exactly this kind of crisis, learning that cooperation wasn't optional. It was the margin between life and death. So when you strip away the myths, the rituals, the sacred wooden figures, and the wolf children, what remains is something startlingly familiar. A resource problem. A community forced to decide, together, how to survive an event biology hadn't fully prepared them for. And a species that responded, again and again, not with abandonment, but with story, with structure, with whatever version of care its circumstances allowed. Today, twin births are almost never a crisis. Formula exists. Neonatal units exist. A second lactating mother is no longer a matter of survival. But somewhere underneath the modern relief of an ultrasound, revealing 2 heartbeats instead of 1, there's a much older echo. A memory written into culture rather than biology. Of a time when 2 children arriving at once wasn't simply double the joy. It was a test. One that every community on Earth, in its own way, was forced to answer. And maybe that's the real story here. Not that ancient humans were harsher than we are, or more superstitious, or less capable of love. But that long before hospitals, before formula, before any of the safety nets we now take for granted, humanity was already building the only technology it had for surviving an impossible choice. Not medicine, not tools, meaning.